Good evening and welcome to our webinar on sensory integration and Tourette syndrome. My name is Ali Gemma, CDC Program Director, and I will be your moderator for the webinar. This webinar is being provided as part of the Tourette Health and Education Program, a program of the Tourette Association in partnership with the CDC. During the webinar, we will be very happy to hear from you and include your voice in the conversation. You can ask questions or share comments using the question panel on the right side of your GoToWebinar player at any time. We will collect your questions and address them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Additionally, you'll note that we have some handouts that you can download from your control panel and will be discussed in the presentation. We are very thrilled to have Heather Simpson as our presenter this evening, who is the Tourette Clinic Coordinator at University of Florida Health Center for Movement Disorders and Neurorestoration, part of the Southeastern Regional Tourette Centers of Excellence Consortium. Heather is a pediatric registered occupational therapist with a specialty in sensory integration and has taken many sensory integration training courses with experience in pediatric outpatient clinics at UF Health. Before we begin, I just want to mention that funding for this webinar was made possible by our cooperative agreement with the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views expressed by speakers and moderators do not necessarily reflect the official policies of the Department of Health and Human Services, nor does the mention of trade names, commercial practices, or organizations imply endorsement by the U.S. government. So now, Heather, please go ahead with your presentation, and I'll go ahead and mute myself.
Great. Thank you, Ali. Thank you, the Tourette Association, and thank you, CDC, for funding this. So we'll go ahead and get started. This is the talk on sensory integration and Tourette syndrome. And I first want to get started and introduce, do you know me? So do either of these kids look familiar, right? So is it the girl that says I am a picky eater, or I don't like the tags on my clothing, or maybe I always have to chew on things, or I have difficulty concentrating and focusing? Well, if they look familiar to you, they certainly look familiar to me, because that kid on the left was me as a kid, and that is me as an adult. So we are going to be talking about sensory integration and how it can be dysfunctional, but it not necessarily is always a bad thing, because we can always, we might have sensory integration issues, because all of those things that I mentioned can be issues, but they can also make us who we are and as a unique individual. Some of the research says 1 in 20 people in the general population have sensory integration dysfunction, and so it just makes us unique individuals. So I want to get started by saying, what is sensory integration? So sensory integration is just organization of our sensations for use. And this term was designated by Jean Ayers, who was an occupational therapist and educational psychologist in the 1960s, who essentially looked at how do we organize our perception, our feelings, our textures, our touch, our smell, and how do we integrate that? And we use that for participation in activities across social, learning, and activities of daily living. And then she asked, how, when we integrate all of those, how do those successfully combine to allow us to use our body in space and engage with others? And sensory integration is a very unconscious and unaware act that happens without us having to think about what is going on. And it also happens spontaneously. We don't have to think very hard about it, and our body plans an adaptive response that allows us sensory input. So this is just a little, this is a little diagram that I found from the resource below that shows how some of the senses, and some of the newest literature is saying that we have 7 senses. There are 3 far senses with sounds, smells, sight, and then we have our near senses, which are touch, taste, vestibular senses, which are movement and balance, and proprioception. And all of those go through our body. We interpret it, our spinal cord or central nervous system interprets that to our brain, and then our body takes that sensory input and determines an adaptive response. And ideally, we have a normal response to it, but sometimes we can have an under response or an over response, and that's what we call sensory integration. So sensory processing disorder, formerly known as sensory integration disorder, is a disorder of the brain and the inability to appropriately process sensory input. So that's when, instead of having a balancing act, we might be under-responding or over-responding. And according to Lucy Jane Miller and her group, about 5 to 15% of the general population have this. And essentially, it's just a misinterpretation of sensory information. And it's unconscious, unaware, we don't mean to do it, and we just have an inability to adapt appropriately to that sensory information that comes into our body. So, and if the sensory information is not integrated properly, then the child will not be able to organize higher level functionings. So I wanted to show you this chart, and you'll see here on the left what typical sensory integration and sensory processing looks like. And you'll see here the Y, for example, typical sensory processing enables a person to survive and make sense of the world. But sensory processing disorders, these sensory input interferes with that. And then the how, sensory processing disorders does not send effective messages. And when, this occurs before, during, or shortly after birth. So it just shows the differences between sensory processing and sensory processing disorder. Now, who can have sensory integration or sensory processing disorder? So there are many different diagnoses, and probably the most common and most heard about is autism spectrum disorder. But as you can see by this nice little diagram, there are lots of people who can have diagnosis of a sensory integration or sensory processing disorder. And over there, probably around the 4 o'clock, you'll see Tourette syndrome. But OCD, anxiety, ADHD, around the 7 o'clock, you'll see gifted students tend to have sensory integration disorder. And then I think in there you should also have a normal developing functioning child as well. So there are many different types of sensory processing disorders, and I'm not going to go through all of them in detail because we don't have enough time, but just very briefly, we're going to talk about sensory modulation disorders, which is essentially the brain's ability to respond appropriately to stimuli. And there are 3 main types. So sensory overresponsivity, which I'm going to go over in the next slide. Underresponsivity, which is where the body doesn't feel pain tolerance very well. So those are those kids who can get a cut and not even realize that they have pain. And then sensory seekers are the ones who run all over the place. That was kind of me, as you could tell by that picture. So then you'll also see there's another category of sensory discrimination, where children and adults have difficulty with determining levels and ranges of varying senses. And then sensory-based motor disorders are where children and adults have difficulty determining what their brains tell them to do with their motor function. So with dyspraxia, children maybe have difficulties learning how to ride bikes. Or postural disorders, those are when kids have troubles sitting upright in their chairs and they always have to lean over and put their head on their hands when they're sitting and writing. So to go into a little bit more in detail, here are some more examples. So your sensory seeking behaviors, you'll see those are your kids who are constantly moving, difficulty sitting still, playing rough with peers. Maybe they don't realize how hard they're pushing. Those kids who fidget constantly, have difficulty following directions. Those kids who possibly love to play on juggle gyms or jumping toys or love to spin. Those kids who love those teacup rides at Disney. Then we have those sensory avoiding behaviors, which are those sensory over-responsive children and adults. And those are those people who get overwhelmed quickly, who maybe don't like crowds, who dislike trying new things. Those who have very picky eating habits, maybe only eat chicken nuggets, fries, mac and cheese, but doesn't want to try vegetables or fruits. Those who have aversions to different types of clothing or materials, appear to be inflexible, doesn't like changes in schedule, and maybe those who appear distracted or disinterested. And then we have motor planning difficulties. So maybe those who have difficulty with completing tasks on time. Maybe they have difficulties with figuring out how to turn in their homework. Maybe those who have sloppy work. Those who are clumsy or accident prone. Those who have difficulty following tasks. Those who are very easily confused when you give them a 2 or 3 step direction, like go upstairs, brush your teeth, and then put on your pajamas. Maybe they get 1 out of 3 of those tasks done. Those who maybe have difficulty completing their self-care skills. So those are the 3 common ones that I see a lot here in my clinic at the Tourette clinic here. And then on the right here is just Winnie Dunn's model of sensory processing, and it just gives you a nice visual of different types of sensory integration strategies, or the continuum that we have that describes some of the sensory behaviors. So in order to have appropriate sensory integration, we must have an adaptive response. So we must organize all of the sensory input, what we hear, what we see, what we smell. We must organize that and have an appropriate process and an appropriate response in order to have a purposeful, goal-directed experience. Essentially, we need to have a just right response. And this just right response is extremely important in order for us to have a functioning day. And in my sessions with my CBIT program, with all my kids, when I was in pediatric rehab, we talk a lot about the just right stage, our being in a great place, because we have to check in with how we are feeling and how our arousal is. And so I am asking kids anywhere from age 4 to adults age 64, how is your arousal? How are you feeling? And I use varying different models like this to say, are you under the curve? Are you over the curve? We need to know, are they just right, or they are underneath that? And so why is that important? Why is sensory integration even important? And you'll see here on this pyramid those 7 senses underneath there. If those 7 senses are not integrated, those higher skills, such as academic learning all the way there at the top of the pyramid, are not going to be appropriately engaged. So if we don't integrate the sensory responses, then we're going to have trouble with daily living activities or behavior or academic learning. So this is the foundation of sensory integration. And you might ask, is it just sensory integration or is it behavior? So it's important to know that you can never assume that it's sensory integration or it's behavior. We have to appropriately address and assess if it is sensory integration or behavior. So the Tourette Association and Kathy Giordano has come up with a great functional behavioral assessment that is available online, and you can type that into their website, or I've added the link here, that allows you to do a nice functional assessment to determine if it is sensory integration or behavior that is creating some of these difficulties that you may or may not be having at school. So what does this mean for Tourette's, right? So we know that many people with Tourette's, the majority of people with Tourette's, have comorbid conditions. And those comorbid conditions, many of them were in that bubble that have sensory integration dysfunction. So ADHD, ADD, ODD, autism spectrum, and then many more. So any of those that were listed, gifted, or all have sensory integration dysfunction. And we also know that patients with TS can also demonstrate rage attacks, and that's clearly something to do with that arousal. We're not getting a just right curve there. Something is not fitting right. Something seemingly just clicks, and we have an abnormal response. We have explosive emotional outbursts and poor frustration tolerance. So sensory integration and this arousal training is extremely important. So how do we address this? So occupational therapists, there are two major types of occupational therapy evaluations. The first one is sensory integration and praxis test. It's the SIPT clinician. And this is a clinician who goes through a 4-week or 4-series 5-day course for a training of an assessment and how to treat kids with sensory integration. So there's an extensive test that demonstrates sensory integration training. So if you want somebody who knows their stuff, a SIPT trained clinician is it. But then if those resources are not available, a standard pediatric occupational therapy evaluation is appropriate. And we look at birth history, your comorbid conditions, neurological evaluations, sleep routine, your daily routine, self-care, behavior, sensory integration, school and home life, and many, many more. So it's a full, comprehensive, holistic evaluation. Now, some of the handouts that Allie has provided for you. First one in here that I wanted to give to you was a sensory processing checklist that might help you give a nice little understanding on whether or not you may notice some sensory integration difficulties within your child. And this is from Raising a Sensory Smart Child. And it goes through each sense, and you just check whether it's avoid, seeks, mixed, or neutral. And areas that are pretty heavy will give you an idea of whether or not your child may or may not need some sensory therapy. And then this one, this teacher checklist that is found on sensorystreet.com, is something that you can take to your teacher that is similar to the one that was provided on the previous slide, that also allows your teacher to fill something out. So it might be addressing some of the behaviors that you might not be seeing at home. So something like chewing on clothing, pencils, craves hot or cold items. So it goes through an extensive checklist that might give you some more input on whether or not you're seeing some sensory behaviors. So what can we do about it? So what is sensory integration training? So when you go see an occupational therapist, there are many things we're going to do. We're going to take a large extensive history, which I described to you earlier, but we're also going to address those hypersensitivities, those hyposensitivities. We're going to do things like a TheraPressure or a brushing protocol. We're going to desensitize. So if your child is overly sensitive to sounds, we're going to decrease that overstimulation. If your child can't tolerate going to the bathroom because the sound is too much to flush the toilet, then we can help desensitize that. There are listening programs that can help train the inner ear. There are feeding programs and feeding therapies that can help your kid get on a healthy diet so that they're not eating only unhealthy foods. There is attention training that can help your child sit still in class or at home to do their homework. There are stress management programs. And one that I use on a very regular basis with all of my CBIT patients is this arousal level training with either the alert program or the Leaky break shop, which I'll talk a little bit further about. But essentially we're teaching children and adults how to self-modulate their arousal levels and their adaptive responses. So we're saying, hey, we're recognizing, I see the warning signs that you're starting to lose it. Let's do some things that might calm you down a little bit so that we don't get to a point where you explode, right? And you can see that picture up top where it has the guy on the little teeter-totter where it says slow, high, and just right. Those are the type of things we do. And you'll see the picture on the bottom right. It's fun therapy. So we play with swings. We play with balls. It's not a boring old room. It's a lot of fun. So what are some goals of therapy? Essentially, our goal is to regulate the system. We want to organize the degree and intensity of the responses of the sensory input. We want to make it so that your child can adapt to those situations so that we don't have these adverse responses. So we want to improve function in daily activities. We want to improve the ability to learn, to engage socially, to improve body awareness, and we want to improve their function in all aspects of their life. So again, you'll see we play with shaving cream if they have texture issues. We spin them if they have difficulty with even riding in the car because they get dizzy. But we do it all in an appropriate strategy and evidenced way to make sure that it's an appropriate way. So what do? We do this thing called a sensory diet. So a sensory diet is not a food-based program, but it's something adapted by the Wilbarger in 1991, and it's a child-specific program that essentially is a personalized activity program that provides sensory input to each person and provides those sensory experiences to each person and each child throughout the day. It is important for arousal and maintaining arousal throughout the day. It's individually tailored to each person, so it's not one fits all. And the ideal is that we are trying to maintain a satisfied nervous system to essentially maintain an even keel, to not have these highs and lows throughout the day. It helps prevent meltdowns. We want to decrease those sensory seeking and avoidant behaviors. And as we know, we're going to provide exercise and movement breaks because exercise has also been shown to minimize tics, and heavy work can assist in assisting with that moderate exercise. So when we implement a sensory diet, we want to make sure we use it as a tool and not a reward or punishment. You want your kids to know that it is something that it's going to help them feel good and not used as something that they have to do or that they're in trouble for. And we do not use as a timeout or reward for significantly bad or good behavior. And we don't want to do it as a social separator if possible. So we like to use as a daily activity. So we like to do it, encourage families to do it in classrooms or at home. So everyone in the family does all of these activities. Or if heavy work needs to be done, then the entire class does it with them. And research shows that these activities can actually help improve the entire class function and not just your kid, but these sensory diets have been proven to help a majority of the population. So when I talked about arousal level management, the Leaky Breaks program through the Child Parent Resource Institute in Ontario, they have some really nice handouts and free resources. It is a phenomenal tool. I have the link here on the bottom for you, but I just want to show you what I use. They use this Leaky Breaks program where they talk about recognizing arousal levels using that beaker up in the far right, and they call it their frustration beaker. And they recognize things that increase arousal. So what makes me frustrated? Is it that I can't play my video games? Is it that I'm having trouble with my homework? Is it my tics? And then they talk about what are the signs. So is it that I'm balling up my fist? Is it that my chest gets red? Is it that I breathe hard? And then session 4 is devoted to teaching you how to recognize, exploring ways to calm that down. So it might be maybe I'm taking some slow breaths. Maybe I use a stress ball. And they have lots and lots of free education. When I work with occupational therapists outside of the Tourette world, I make sure I share this resource with them because it is a very nice free education program that has some very good useful tools. The other thing on here is a calming corner. If you have a child with sensory integration concerns, I would strongly suggest having a calming corner in your house or your school that has calming pillows, maybe some soft music, but something that similar to these pictures on this board that allows for your child to have an escape for when they're recognizing signs of overstimulation or about when they're going to lose those arousal moments. And it's going to be tailored for each individual child, but coming up with a safe place where your child can go to have a nice, calming, relaxing place for 5 or 10 minutes so that they can regroup and come back to appropriately engage in their activities. The other thing I'm a big advocate of is what I call heavy, well, not what I call heavy work, but what the OT world calls heavy work. But I'm a big advocate of in making sure especially kids with tics and Tourette's have the opportunity to have at least 30 minutes of play, structured play, movement breaks after school to do about 30 minutes of play and movement right after school before completing homework or any sort of structured task. Because a lot of the kids are having to hold in their tics throughout the day and they're dealing with stress, bullies, etc. So I've provided a list of some strategies that essentially encourage using their muscles, and some of that includes vacuuming, gardening, cleaning the house, stuff that maybe helping you carry in the groceries. They can run, they can climb, things that are safe. They can do animal walks, they can do exercises, but anything that encourages them to use their muscles prior to them doing their homework will help them improve their homework time. Another resource that I've provided you is this Heavy Works for Teacher list that was on the Sensory Street as well, and this are sensory resources. This also is something that teachers can be provided on ways that your child can engage in sensory heavy work in the classroom. And a lot of times it's nice that the children can do in class and it looks very normal. So they might just be the teacher's helper and get to take, you know, a set of books to the next room, and that signals to your child that they need a movement break. So it's a whole list of activities that they can use. This is an example picture of the alert program. So some therapists use the alert program that talks about my engine level is running too high, which means I'm running way too fast and using way too much energy. And so sometimes I call out the kids I work with and I say, what's your engine level? And they say, oh, Miss Heather, it's too high. I say, okay, what do we do to bring it to a just right level? And so this is just an example of one of the programs that we use. And this Life Skills for Kids is another free handout provided you from the sensorystreet.com. It's a really big handout, but it talks about a whole lot of relaxation strategies that might be really good to explore as part of ways to decrease those arousal levels when you're starting to recognize those signs of poor adaptive responses with sensory integration. So, in summary, if you have concerns about sensory integration, first thing I would do is ask your primary care physician for a screening in clinic and then a referral to a local occupational therapist who provides sensory integration training. If you don't know of one, ask around. But the SPD Foundation has a good website on tips for finding trained occupational therapists, and I have that link provided to you. And then big thing with sensory integration, the only way you will get better is follow through at home, and knowing that it is going to be fun for your child. Sensory integration a lot of time is fun, and following through that and having that engagement and enjoyment for them will be fun for them as well. So I've also provided you with many apps for sensory integration. Not all of them will be appropriate for you and your child, but some of them are visual sensory integration apps where they're very nice and calming, lava lamp type apps, or some of them are soft music, some of them are breathing apps, but one of them is a behavioral reward app. So go ahead, and there are many different types, and it depends on what type of tablet or phone you use, but wanted to share some of those resources with you. Then also several resources as far as websites that I have. Many of them, those last two, Chad and Attitude Magazine, also have free webinars as well on ADHD and sensory integration. And then helpful books. Those first three, the sensory integration and the child, the out of sync child, and the out of sync child have fun, are probably my three most popular that I recommend quite a bit. And then down there, that Taming the Tiger book is really popular for recommendations for school strategies for Tourette's and ADHD. And then another handout that we have provided are these sensory processing disorder cards. And essentially they're little cards. You can laminate it, you can color it, but it says, my child is out of sync right now and needs time to reorganize. And essentially it's like the Tourette Association cards. It says, my child has Tourette's, essentially, please understand, give us time. And this is the sensory processing version of those cards. And then I've listed all of the resources and links that I've provided within the slides so that you can look back for any of those pictures if you wanted to share any of them. And as always, thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Heather. This is a fantastic, great presentation, and I think the content was very relevant to folks tuning in. So we're now going to begin the answer to answer your questions submitted through tonight's presentation. As a reminder, you can still submit your questions through the questions pane in your control panel. So we have a couple of questions that have already come in. So Heather, the first one is it possible to be sensory seeking and avoiding, or rather to be affected by more than one type of sensory integration?
Great question. Absolutely. I am many of those categories. You absolutely can have many of the different categories, and it very much depends on the day and what sensation as well. So you can have sensory avoiding tendencies and textures, but maybe sensory seeking in the vestibular area. Absolutely. There's no cut and dry right in this. Yes.
Okay. Next question. My son is almost 15 and in high school. Is it too late to start therapy on this?
Absolutely not, if he wants it. um, it is, I have treated many children and adults with sensory integration. Most important thing is if your son wants it. And a lot of times it actually can be a really nice transition before college to learn some of these sensory integration strategies. And a lot of times it's stuff that we use to help us study with finals. So even kids who are 15, 16, 17 use strategies such as maybe chewing gum to help us stay awake when we're studying for an exam. That's an example of a sensory integration strategy. And so a good sensory integration therapist can help adapt some of these childlike things into a teenager aspect. But absolutely, a teenager would definitely be appropriate.
Okay. Someone asked, can I have a list of the sensory apps? And
Mm-hmm.
Heather, I know you have it in your slide, and I mentioned, I think I sent it to everyone that we'll actually be recording the webinar, and it will be available on the Tourette Association YouTube channel, but I'll also be able to send people a copy of the PowerPoint handout.
Great.
With copies of the slides that has the list on there.
Great.
And I can email that. My email is alexandra@tourette.org, but you can also email our information or referral staff at support@tourette.org.
Great.
Okay. Can you describe the link between sensory integration and tics? Is it that the overstimulation of senses can trigger the tics?
Ooh, well, that's a great question. There is no research behind that at this point. We are at UF are actually doing a study right now just trying to assess if sensory integration is truly more associated with Tourette's than not. However, if I had to guess, I would certainly think that there is a strong component of sensory input and poor adaptive responses leading to inability to manage tics, meaning that you might see more tics occur when stress occurs because you're not able to manage your tics very well. So when my tag's bothering me in my clothes, you might see more tics occurring. Absolutely. But there's no evidence-based research behind that at this point. But that would be my guess. I'm sorry, I couldn't tell you more, but that's where we'd like to go and research.
Great. That was a great question. All right, we have another one. Is it common to deny the behaviors that a child might exhibit due to anxiety and SID when dealing with administration at school?
Great. Can you repeat that one more time, the first part of that for me, please?
Is it common to deny the behaviors that a child might exhibit due to anxiety and sensory integration disorders when dealing with administration at school?
Yes, thank you for asking that. Is that common from the parent perspective, or meaning is that common from the school? So I'll address it from both. I have seen many schools in the past relate, kind of scoot around the issue of sensory integration because they're not sure what it is, or because of the diagnosis itself at school, and aren't sure how to treat it, and therefore it has never, it doesn't get addressed at school, and therefore it becomes a behavioral disorder versus a sensory integration disorder.
And Heather, sorry, I think the person had clarified this would be from the child.
Oh, okay, thank you. Absolutely, absolutely, and that's why those teacher forms, I really am a big advocate of teacher forms, the teacher questionnaires. And the other thing is, if you feel like a child does not self-report any of these concerns, you can also ask for a 504 or an assessment at school that would allow an occupational therapist to come in and screen or evaluate your child and determine if those issues are coming up in a functional environment. So not an objective, not a subjective standpoint, but more of an objective viewpoint.
Okay. We do have another question. My son has TS and is 5, very sensitive to different foods. We have tried several times with the same foods, but he refuses to try new foods because of what they look like, smell, texture. Any suggestions?
Yes, very much so. I would seek an occupational therapist feeding aversion referral. I have those issues myself, and I wish I would have gotten therapy a long time ago. There are a bunch of occupational therapists who specialize in feeding aversion. There are something like 65, 67, I know I'm saying that wrong, senses to feeding. And that includes touch, smell, taste, and if any of those become offensive in any way, then feeding and picky eating becomes an issue. So having an occupational therapist to do a full assessment would be very valuable. And what they do is they can run a feeding clinic, or they can do a feeding intervention one-on-one, where they actually integrate that and teach the child how to appropriately tolerate textures and integrate new food without becoming averse to it before it becomes problematic.
Okay, and it looks like that's most of the questions, but you know, we still have some time to submit questions. So I guess we'll take a next couple of minutes just to let people submit a couple more, and then we'll end.
Yes. While I'm doing that, here I'll come back to this slide. There we go.
Okay, so we do have another question.
Okay.
I work as a COTA in mental health.
Okay.
I too have a son with TS. However, do you have a specific resource to simplify explanation for sensory integration? We use many mindful techniques, but are looking for a way to explain sensory integration more effectively to our patients.
Yes. So for children, I say essentially sensory integration essentially is how your body tells you about the world itself, or how the world interprets what's going on around you. And I'm sorry, that's kind of flying off the seat of my pants here, but because it's just how your body adapts or responds to what's going on, to all the senses. What I like to do with kids when I get them is I draw them a hand, and I put all the senses on the end of a hand, and I ask them to tell me, you know, a little bit about each of their sensations and what they like and what they don't like about each one of those. And then that's what I call sensor integration. So I adapt it to each age. So I will actually devote a whole session a lot of times to describing sensory integration, because it's very critical for them to understand why their body's understanding, or why their body's feeling what they're feeling.
Okay, great. So I think we'll take a couple more minutes and just let people submit any last questions for Heather. And in case you have any questions that you think of later and would like to ask, again, you can email us at our information referral department, and that's support@tourette.org. Okay, so I think that's actually all the questions.
Okay.
So just everyone who's still on the webinar, once you leave the webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate if you would complete that and provide your feedback. You will also receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view a recording of today's webinar, and we'll also put it on our Tourette Association YouTube channel for those who were unable to participate today. And we encourage you to reach out to us on social media about this webinar and other ideas and suggestions that you have. And on behalf of the Tourette Association, thank you again for joining us and taking the time to view our presentation. And thank you so much, Heather. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Thank you.